Commercial aviation today is one of the safest ways to travel, with fatal accidents measured in only a few per million flights. This level of security is the product of decades of reforms, investigations, and constant oversight. But not every airline meets those safety standards. Some carriers built records scarred by repeated crashes in short spans of time. Others expose deep flaws in training or maintenance that regulators could not ignore. From a 747 that shattered mid-air after a botched repair, to a low-cost operator undone by mishandled oxygen canisters, we're about to look at some of the most dangerous airlines in history. Number 1. China Airline. Between 1994 and 2002, China Airlines suffered 4 major accidents that raised questions about its safety culture and oversight. The string of crashes marked the carrier as one of the most scrutinized airlines of the era, with investigators pointing to recurring issues in both training and maintenance. The most devastating event came in May 2002 when Flight 611, a Boeing 747 bound for Hong Kong, disintegrated in mid-air over the Taiwan Strait. All 225 passengers and crew were killed. Investigators traced the cause back to a repair performed in 1980s after a tail strike in Hong Kong. Instead of replacing an entire section of the fuselage, mechanics applied a doubler plate that failed to properly restore structural integrity. Over 2 decades, undetected fatigue cracks spread until the pressure vessel ruptured in flight. Flight 611 was not an isolated case. In the 90s, China Airlines lost aircraft in Nagoya, Taipei, and near Hong Kong, each accident underscoring a pattern of pilot error, inadequate training, or procedural lapses. The repetition of events placed the airline under heavy scrutiny from regulators in Taiwan and abroad. International audits flagged both cockpit discipline and maintenance oversight, pushing the company to confront systemic weaknesses rather than isolated mistakes. After 2002, China Airlines committed to reforms. Training programs were expanded, safety management systems were formalized, and external reviews were conducted to restore credibility. Fleet modernization and stricter engineering oversight were introduced to prevent a repeat of the lapses that led to Flight 611. While the airline has improved its safety record since then, the legacy of the 1990s and early 2000s remains a reminder of how organizational culture and maintenance standards can decide the difference between routine operations and disaster. Number 2. Korean Air. By the late 1990s, Korean Air had developed a reputation for repeated accidents that pointed to deeper systemic flaws. The most serious was Flight 801 in August 1997, a Boeing 747 approaching Guam in poor weather. The aircraft struck terrain short of the runway, killing 229 of the 254 people on board. Investigators cited inadequate pilot training, fatigue, and poor crew resource management as central factors. Flight 801 was not an isolated incident. A string of crashes earlier in the decade had already drawn global attention, with regulators and partner airlines questioning the carrier's safety culture. Analysts noted hierarchical cockpit dynamics that discouraged open communication, leaving first officers reluctant to challenge captains even in emergencies. Combined with inconsistent training standards, these cultural and procedural issues created fertile ground for accidents. The response was sweeping. Korean Air invested billions in modernizing its fleet, global best practices. Independent audits were invited, and leadership restructured operations around safety management principles. Over time, accident rates declined, and the airline gradually rebuilt its reputation. Today, Korean Air is seen as an example of how organizational reform and external scrutiny can turn around a troubled safety record. Number 3. Pakistan International Airlines. Pakistan International Airlines was once considered a model flag carrier in South Asia, but by 2020, its reputation had been eroded by repeated concerns over operations and oversight. The turning point came in May of that year when Flight 8303 crashed while attempting to land in Karachi. The Airbus A320 struck residential buildings after its engines failed, killing 97 of the 99 people on board. Investigators concluded that pilot error was the primary cause, noting that the crew attempted a landing with the landing gear retracted and damaged both engines before trying to go around. The crash exposed deeper problems. In the aftermath, Pakistan's aviation minister admitted that a significant number of PIA pilots held dubious or improperly obtained licenses. This revelation drew international condemnation and raised questions about the airline's training and licensing standards. It also triggered a wider review of regulatory practices within Pakistan's Civil Aviation Authority. Regulators in Europe responded swiftly. The European Union Aviation Safety Agency suspended PIA's authorization to operate in European airspace, a ban that remains in place. Other jurisdictions followed with similar restrictions, cutting the airline off from some of its most lucrative international routes. Number 4. Avianca. In January 1990, Avianca Flight 052, a Boeing 707 from Bogota to New York, ran out of fuel and crashed on approach to JFK International Airport. The aircraft had been placed into multiple holding patterns due to congestion and poor weather. After more than an hour in holding, the crew attempted to land with insufficient reserves. The jet struck a hillside in Cove Neck, Long Island, killing 73 of the 158 people on board. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation found no mechanical failure. Instead, the accident was traced to a communication breakdown between the crew and air traffic control. The Avianca pilots told controllers they were running out of fuel, but never used the phrase fuel emergency or mayday. Under stress and fatigue, the crew believed the severity was understood, while controllers treated the situation as a routine low-fuel advisory. The misphraseology proved fatal. Flight 52 became a textbook case in crew resource management and international communication standards. Regulators emphasized the need for clear, standardized declarations in emergencies, regardless of language or culture. Airlines incorporated scenarios into training programs to drill explicit calls like minimum fuel and mayday fuel to eliminate ambiguity. For Avianca, Flight 052 exposed vulnerabilities that went beyond a single cockpit. The crash unfolded at a time when the airline was already under financial pressure and operating in a volatile political climate, making its shortcomings more visible. Number 5. Lion Air. On October 29, 2018, Lion Air Flight 610 left Jakarta in a brand new Boeing 737 MAX and crashed into the Java Sea just minutes after takeoff. All 189 passengers and crew were killed. The disaster was quickly tied to a new software feature called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. Faulty data from a single sensor fed into the system, which forced the nose of the aircraft down repeatedly. The crew fought to counteract the inputs but could not regain control. While the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System design flaw drew worldwide attention, the operator's record also came under scrutiny. Investigators pointed out that Lion Air had struggled with maintenance reliability and uneven pilot training standards. Previous flights of the same jet had experienced problems with the angle of attack system, but the aircraft was returned to service. Critics argued that a stronger maintenance culture and clearer documentation might have prevented the aircraft from being dispatched in that condition. The crash had global consequences. Airlines and regulators around the world grounded the 737 MAX fleet in early 2019 after a second fatal accident in Ethiopia highlighted the same system. Documentation, checklists, and training for crews were rewritten to cover Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System behavior explicitly, and certification processes for new systems came under far greater scrutiny. Number 6. Terra Air. Flying in Nepal is inherently demanding. Aircraft operate from short mountain strips at high altitude, where weather conditions can change in minutes. For pilots, the margin of error is narrow, and every decision carries amplified risk. Terra Air, a regional operator within this environment, has faced repeated scrutiny for accidents tied to these challenging conditions. In May 2022, Terra Air Flight 197 left Pokhara for Jomsom, a route that winds through steep valleys beneath the Annapurna Range. The de Havilland Twin Otter never reached its destination. Instead, it crashed into terrain, killing all 22 people on board. Investigators determined that the crew had deactivated the aircraft's terrain warning system and continued into cloud-covered valleys, a decision that removed a key safeguard. Pilot error was cited as the principal cause. The accident underscored how environmental risk compounds when standard operating procedures are not followed and protective systems are disabled. Nepal's aviation sector already carried a reputation for high accident rates, reflected in bans from the European Union on local carriers. Flight 197 reinforced those concerns. For Terra Air, it highlighted how the combination of difficult geography, operational pressures, and lapses in cockpit discipline can be unforgiving, turning routine flights into fatal events. Number 7. Turkish Airlines. The crash of Flight 981 remains one of the most infamous accidents in aviation history. The McDonnell Douglas DC-10 departed Paris-Orly on a routine trip to London. But shortly after takeoff, the rear cargo door gave way. The sudden decompression tore through the cabin floor, severed control cables, and left the crew unable to control the aircraft. It went down in the Ermenonville forest, killing all 346 people on board. Investigators found that the cargo door design was fatally flawed. Its latching system could give the appearance of being secure when in fact the hooks had not locked into place. This weakness had been flagged years earlier but never fully corrected, and on Flight 981 the defect proved disastrous. The aftermath forced regulators and manufacturers to confront gaps in certification oversight. Cargo door mechanisms across multiple fleets were redesigned, inspection requirements tightened, and redundancy in control systems became a renewed focus for wide-body aircraft. Turkish Airlines carried the scars of its worst accident, while McDonnell Douglas faced intense criticism for ignoring warnings about the DC-10's vulnerabilities. Number 8. Pan Am. The disaster at Tenerife in March 1977 remains the deadliest accident in aviation history. Two Boeing 747 aircraft, operated by KLM and Pan Am, collided on the single runway at Los Rodeos Airport in the Canary Islands. Low visibility from thick fog, a congested airfield after a bomb threat diverted traffic, and a series of radio miscommunications all contributed to the tragedy. When the KLM jet began its takeoff roll without final clearance, the Pan Am aircraft was still taxiing on the same runway. The impact killed 583 people, including 335 on the Pan Am flight. Investigators identified several factors. The fog left controllers without a clear view of runway operations. Radio calls overlapped, leaving crucial words unheard. The KLM captain, a senior instructor with high standing in the airline, advanced the throttles prematurely, and the Pan Am crew could not vacate the runway in time. The accident reshaped global procedures. Standardized phraseology was introduced to eliminate ambiguity, with explicit terms like cleared for takeoff and stand by replacing less formal language. Controllers and pilots were trained to confirm instructions without assumption, especially in degraded visibility. Tenerife became a turning point in crew resource management. The hierarchical cockpit culture that silenced junior crew members was reconsidered worldwide, and regulators emphasized direct, assertive communication between tower and cockpit. Number 9. American Airlines. American Airlines has endured two of the most serious crashes in U.S. aviation history, both of which revealed very different vulnerabilities in operations and training. The first was Flight 191 in May 1979, a DC-10 leaving Chicago O'Hare. Seconds after takeoff, the left engine separated from the wing, tearing away hydraulic and electrical lines. The aircraft rolled inverted and crashed, killing all 271 people aboard. Investigators traced the failure to damage in the engine pylon mounts, caused during an improper maintenance procedure that used forklifts to remove engines rather than the manufacturer's recommended method. More than 2 decades later, in November 21, Flight 587 left JFK bound for the Dominican Republic. After encountering wake turbulence from a Japan Airlines 747, the first officer applied a series of rapid rudder inputs. The vertical stabilizer snapped off under the loads, sending the A30 into a neighborhood in Queens and killing 265 people. This accident highlighted how control input discipline, particularly in high-load situations, could be as critical as structural strength itself. The two events forced significant changes. Maintenance oversight and inspection procedures were tightened to prevent structural damage from improper work practices. Training programs placed new emphasis on upset recovery, rudder sensitivity, and avoiding overcontrol. Together, these crashes showed how a major airline can face risks not from design flaws alone, but from the way procedures are carried out on the ground and in the cockpit. Number 10. United Airlines. Two very different accidents placed United Airlines at the center of some of the most studied safety cases in modern aviation. In July 1989, Flight 232, a DC-10 traveling from Denver to Chicago, suffered an uncontained engine failure. Shrapnel from the engine destroyed all 3 hydraulic systems, leaving the crew with no conventional way to control the aircraft. Through extraordinary coordination, the pilots managed to guide the crippled jet to Sioux City, Iowa. The crash landing killed 111 of the 296 on board, but 185 survived. The amount of people that survived was described as remarkable by many experts, given the total loss of hydraulics. Just 2 years later, in March 1991, United Flight 585, a 737, crashed in Colorado Springs during approach, killing all 25 people on board. For years, investigators struggled to identify a cause. Eventually, the accident was linked to a design vulnerability in the rudder control system, which could jam and deflect without pilot input. The finding also tied into later accidents, prompting a redesign of the rudder system across the 737 fleet. Together, the two events emphasized different lessons: the need for true redundancy in critical systems, awareness of rare but catastrophic failure modes, and training that prepares crews to manage the unexpected. Regulators and manufacturers responded with design reviews, simulator scenarios, and updates to upset recovery training, aiming to prevent a repeat of either situation. Number 11. Malaysia Airlines. In 2014, Malaysia Airlines faced two tragedies that stand among the most significant in modern aviation. In March, flight MH370, a Boeing 777 flying from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, vanished from radar with 239 people on board. Despite years of search efforts, only small pieces of wreckage were ever recovered, and the main cause of the disappearance is still unknown. The case raised worldwide calls for better tracking of long-haul aircraft and clearer systems for sharing flight data across countries. Only 4 months later, in July 2014, Flight MH17, another Boeing 777, was shot down while crossing eastern Ukraine during a period of armed conflict. All 298 passengers and crew were killed. Investigators determined that a missile brought into the region had struck the aircraft. The disaster forced airlines to take a closer look at flight routes and whether passenger aircraft should pass over conflict zones. These two events, coming so close together, were devastating for Malaysia Airlines and its passengers' families. For aviation worldwide, they showed how safety depends not only on equipment and training, but also on global coordination and planning. Airlines and regulators began routing flights more cautiously and paying closer attention to risks from conflict areas, lessons that continue to guide operations today. Number 12. ValueJet. ValueJet was one of the fastest-growing low-cost airlines in the United States during the mid-1990s, but its name became permanently linked to one of the decade's most notorious crashes. On May 11, 1996, Flight 592, a DC-9, departed Miami for Atlanta. Just minutes after takeoff, smoke filled the cabin as fire spread from the cargo hold. The aircraft lost control and plunged into the Florida Everglades, killing all 110 passengers and crew. The investigation revealed that the fire had started when chemical oxygen generators, which produce oxygen through heat-producing reactions, were improperly packaged and loaded as cargo. These devices were supposed to be secured, discharged, and labeled as hazardous materials, but the rules were not followed. The shipment had been handled by a maintenance contractor working on behalf of ValueJet. When the generators ignited, the fire spread quickly through the cargo hold, which lacked fire suppression equipment. The disaster exposed serious weaknesses in how hazardous materials were documented and handled in aviation. Regulators overhauled rules for dangerous goods, requiring stricter packaging, labeling, and training. Contracted maintenance vendors came under closer scrutiny, with airlines held directly accountable for the actions of their subcontractors. The Federal Aviation Administration also moved to mandate fire detection and suppression systems in Class D cargo holds, closing a regulatory gap that allowed fire to spread unchecked on Flight 592. For ValueJet, the accident was a turning point. The airline's reputation collapsed, and it eventually merged with AirTran to survive. Industry-wide, Flight 592 served as a harsh reminder that low-cost operations do not excuse lapses in safety, documentation, or oversight. Even one failure in the chain of accountability can lead to a catastrophic result. Number 13. Air France. On June 1, 2009, Air France Flight 447, an A330 traveling from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, was lost over the Atlantic Ocean with 228 people on board. It took nearly 2 years to locate the main wreckage and recover the flight recorders, making it one of the most complex investigations in aviation history. The sequence began when the aircraft's pitot tubes, which measure airspeed, iced over during flight through storm clouds. With unreliable speed data, the autopilot disconnected, handing control back to the crew. The pilots reacted by pulling the nose up, but at high altitude, the aircraft entered an aerodynamic stall. Instead of lowering the nose to recover, the crew maintained back pressure on the controls. The stall continued for more than 4 minutes until the aircraft struck the ocean. Investigators highlighted both technical and human factors. The pitot tubes were later redesigned to resist icing, but the larger issue was training. Crews needed more preparation for manual flying when air data becomes unreliable and for recognizing high-altitude stalls. The aftermath saw airlines and regulators worldwide incorporate new scenarios into simulator programs. High-altitude stall recovery, unreliable airspeed drills, and clearer communication protocols were added to recurrent training. Number 14. SCAT Airlines. This was a regional carrier in Kazakhstan that came under international scrutiny after a series of safety concerns. Its most serious accident occurred with Flight 760, a Bombardier CRJ-200 on approach to Almaty in 2013. The crew attempted a missed approach in poor weather, but they lost control and the aircraft crashed, killing all 21 people on board. Investigators determined that pilot error in challenging conditions was the primary cause. For years, Kazakhstan's aviation sector faced oversight questions, and SCAT was among the operators banned at times from European Union airspace. These restrictions were not based solely on individual accidents, but reflected broader concerns about training, maintenance standards, and regulatory supervision at the national level. Flight 760 showed how thin the safety margins can be when bad weather, operational pressure, and human error intersect. Once the approach became unstable, recovery proved impossible, highlighting the need for strict adherence to procedures in degraded conditions. The lessons extended well beyond a single carrier. Regulators emphasized the value of strong safety management systems, clear decision-making protocols, and reliable crew training to prevent similar accidents. In regions where terrain and weather pose extra challenges, those systems become even more critical to keeping operations safe. Number 15. Aeroflot. During the Soviet era, Aeroflot was the world's largest airline, carrying millions of passengers across vast territories. Its scale, however, was matched by a troubling safety record, with cultural and procedural problems surfacing in a number of crashes. One of the most notorious examples was Flight 6502 in 1986. The aircraft, a Tu-134, was on approach to Kuybyshev, today's Samara, when the captain attempted an unauthorized experiment. He had reportedly made a bet that he could land using instruments only, without any visual reference. To prove his point, he ordered the cockpit curtains drawn and flew the final approach blind. The result was catastrophic. The jet touched down at excessive speed, overran the runway, and crashed. 70 of the 94 people on board were killed. Investigators concluded that the disaster stemmed directly from the captain's reckless actions and a breakdown of safety culture. Standard operating procedures were ignored, and the chain of command in the cockpit failed to challenge the decision. It reflected an era when deference to authority often overrode professional judgment. For Aeroflot, Flight 6502 became symbolic of the dangers created when discipline and oversight collapse. The aircraft itself was technically capable, but organizational culture negated that capability. In later years, as Russian aviation modernized, the legacy of cases like 6502 drove home the need for stronger crew resource management, stricter adherence to procedures, and a recognition that no amount of technical skill can compensate for a disregard of basic safety. The history of these 15 airlines shows how training gaps, maintenance mistakes, cultural issues, and even geopolitical risks can turn deadly when discipline breaks down. Each case left a mark on aviation, and the reforms that followed made flying safer worldwide. For more detailed aviation stories and industry analysis, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive into the history and future of air travel.